Nostalgia's like a beautiful cherry on the icing of my relationship with football. Like, a lot of my relationship with football is active and in the present tense, but nostalgia is like a really fun sideline to dip into from time to time. Like, I'm going to watch all Eric Cantona's goals, or I'm going to think about how good David Beckham was in the 98-99 season, or I'm just going to think about Dwight York for 20 minutes. You know, it is a kind of optional extra on the real lived experience of watching football in the here and now.
That was Paul Ansorge, and I'm Joe Devine. Welcome to Whiteboard Football Extra. For the next 2 episodes of this podcast, the theme is nostalgia. I wanted to find out if nostalgia affects our relationships with football in the same way that it might do with art. For example, it's often said that people develop the strongest bonds with bands or singers in their early teenage years, bonds that will stick with them throughout their adult life. I questioned whether this was the same for football, whether nostalgia plays as big a part in adults enjoying the sport. To discuss this in more detail, I spoke with 5 people about their relationships with the sport, including journalists Iain Macintosh and James Montague, regular contributor and columnist Paul Ansorge, Premier League photographer and winner of the Premier League Photographer of the 20 Seasons Award, Mark Leach, and his business partner and my uncle, Norwich City fan and part of the committee for the Capital Canaries, Norwich City's fan club in London, Devine. I asked each person about their earliest and fondest memories of the sport, the relationships built around the sport, and whether, as an adult, they still actually liked football. First on the list is Iain Macintosh.
My earliest memory of football was watching the 1986 FA Cup final, which was Liverpool against Everton, and the perfect sort of cup final. Everton take the lead, Liverpool come back, so you have that kind of that seesaw, that the surprise aspect. Liverpool were actually terrible for about the first 70 minutes, and then suddenly turned it on. And then after that, it was the 86 World Cup, so it's pretty much just sitting cross-legged in front of the telly in my pyjamas on late summer evenings, just absorbing all of this football. And of course you had England, who typically started off appalling and then suddenly made it look like they might actually be able to go and win the thing before being turfed out of it by Diego Maradona. And after that, I don't know, everything sort of steamrolled. I couldn't get enough football input. I'd just read everything. A Match magazine, a Shoot magazine, and my dad's old Eagle annuals and Roy of the Rovers annuals, Roy of the Rovers comics, every newspaper I could get hold of. There wasn't any aspect of football that didn't interest me. And by the age of about 9 or 10, I was kind of a walking, breathing stat machine. And so I think it very much appealed to my geeky side as well. But I didn't actually go to a game until I was about 12 or 13, I think, because my family wasn't really a football family. My dad, he was a copper, and football to him, as he once memorably put it, was stopping one group of skinheads from stabbing the other group of skinheads. And so having done games and lots of nastiness, he really didn't want to take his young child along to it, which was, quite common at the time. So it was a long time before I actually went to watch a game of football. Before that, it was just absorbing this incredible new world.
When you first started watching football, you mentioned your dad there. Was it him that you shared the experience with, or was it friends? And I wonder as well if that informed your relationship with your friends, or if your friends, informed your relationship with football.
No, completely the opposite. For the most part, my relationship with football was solitary. My dad might sort of poke his head around the corner and maybe watch a bit of a game here and there, but he wasn't really very interested. My mum certainly wasn't, and my sister was much younger than me. So football was very much a solitary activity for me.
And is that the same now? I'm trying to, what I'm asking people, wondering about, is if they're watching football either in the same way that they were as a child, or if they were watching it with people, with the same people.
I think strangely it's gone back to being a solitary activity now. From the age of about sort of 16, it was, we'd be in the pub on a Monday night every night watching whatever game was on. And that stayed the same way pretty much until I started writing about football for a living when I was 29. You go and watch games in the pub, or you go, used to go Barnet with my mates because that was just up the top of the Northern Line. It was £9 a ticket. I used to go Southend. But now that it's my job, and I'm married and I have a child and neither of them want to watch football, it has kind of done a full loop. It's mostly me and my laptop watching games quietly and on my own, which makes it sound very sad, but I just want to reassure everyone listening I'm very happy.
But this is one of the themes that's come up with the other people I've spoken to about this, though, is that generally speaking, football seems to be best suited to a collective experience. So you're either in the stadium surrounded by people maybe you don't know, or you're watching football with friends, people you do know. Watching football on your own, obviously people enjoy doing that, and people do, as evidenced by the fact that you enjoy your own life, Ian. That's lovely. But it's a very different experience, right? How do you find it to be different to that collective experience that we're talking about?
I find it very hard to watch football in a collective kind of situation now, because I'll get frustrated. For me, after 10 years of doing this, every single game I watch is, whether it's conscious or not, it's a form of work. I'm watching it. I want to watch the shape. I want to look out for new players. I know that if I sit down and watch a game for 90 minutes, there's going to be maybe an article that I can get out of it. The next time I'm on a football show talking about football, I'm going to draw something from that game. And now if I'm in a pub or I'm around a mate's house or there's other people in the room, you notice how much everyone talks. Football you can watch football on a number of levels, and I think a lot of the time people will have the game on, but they'll be talking amongst themselves. They might not even be talking about the game itself while the game's on, and I sit there and get a bit frustrated. It's like, everyone shut up, I'm trying to figure out what the fullbacks are doing. So
you're watching it as a journalist, right? I mean,
yeah.
My next question is, do you still like football? Which might seem strange to someone who works in the industry, but from your description there, you're watching football as a journalist. Do you enjoy that, or what is it that you enjoy there? Is it the journalism? Is it the analysing of the game, or are you enjoying the football?
I think, ironically, given that my role is to provide words to explain situations, I haven't got the words to explain how much I love doing what I do. Going from being a kid just reading absolutely everything about football into being a teenager reading absolutely everything about football, knowing that you're so bad at playing football that there's no chance whatsoever, even in the event of a nuclear war, that you're ever going to play football at any decent level. And just wanting so much to be a part of the football world, to be able to dedicate so much time to just hurling yourself into the football world. And then suddenly at the age of 29, having it there, that the more football you watch, the harder you are working. You're not watching football, you're working. It's amazing. It's such a profound impact on my life. I mean, I'm the sort of person who used to play the old Championship Manager, Football Manager games, and when the fixtures would come up and my team wasn't playing, I would watch one. And I'd think to myself, I remember sitting there like about 23 and I had a futon in a tiny room in Archway in Championship Manager 2001-2002, and I'd be clicking games to watch that were not my team and thinking, my God, imagine if this was my life. If my life was like looking at the 10 Premier League fixtures and going, right, I'm going to go and watch that one because I think that'll be a good one. And then in 2007, I started working for the new paper in Singapore, and that was literally my life. That was what I did every week. I picked the games to watch. I watch it in a very different way now. I don't get overexcited. I don't have the same irrational hatred that I used to have. I tend to be much, much more objective. But I still love it. And that's just watching it.
Do you ever have an emotional connection to football now?
I've tried to stamp it out as much as possible. I think in the very early years when I started writing about football, I could occasionally get... I like Chelsea, for example. As a lower league football fan, I'm a Southend fan. As a lower league football fan, I, like loads of other people, were really angry about Chelsea suddenly buying lots of players. And that used to come across in my writing in the first sort of few months. And then I realised what was happening and how the reader doesn't want to know my personal prejudices. I'm in a privileged position of being able to watch football for a living. They want to know what I make of it from an objective point of view. So, I find it very difficult to hate or love in a weird kind of way. I don't have favourites. It's the thing that always makes me laugh. People say, you're biased, you've got an agenda. It's like, one, you overestimate my influence. There's nothing. I have no power whatsoever to push anything. And two, why do you think I care about your team more than any other team? No, that's the way I see my role. I see my role as being an objective observer who will sit and watch a game, and if something's bad, we'll say it's bad, and if something's good, we'll say it's good. And unfortunately, you can't do that while you've got personal prejudices or preferences. Or at least I can't. I'm sure some people can, but I find it a bit more difficult. So that was a very long, rambling answer. But yeah.
Well, I've got one final question, and I appreciate some of these are not the easiest to answer without a little bit of forethought. But what I'm really interested in there is you say that you've tried to sort of stamp out an emotional connection to the football that you're watching. You watch it as an objective observer. You're writing about it. If there's no emotional connection to football, what is it that you like about what do you like about football? I know it sounds like an absurd, really simple question, but I don't understand.
It works for me on two levels. One, that you enter this gigantic, sprawling epic, which began long before you were born and will continue, hopefully, long after you die. And everything is interconnected. The clubs, the players, the managers, everything has strands weaving across. It's, people get into Game of Thrones or Lord of the Rings. It's bigger than all of that. That there is so much that has already happened. You'll never get to a point where you know absolutely everything. You are immersed in this living, breathing, evolving, epic story. So that's one. That's quite a good one to start with. But the other one is that outside of all the bullshit, outside of all the spats and newspaper battles and new kit launches and whataboutery, outside of all of that, just being able to sit there and watch 11 blokes come out on one side and 11 on the other, and you can smell the grass and you can hear the crowd, and then the whistle blows and off it goes, and through years of experience that anything can happen. It probably won't, probability suggests that the better team is likely to win, but anything can happen. It could be a complete shock, it could be a complete thumping, it could be the worst football match you've ever watched. Once you strip away all the bullshit, having that one battle, that one 90-minute game, that still excites me as much as it did when I first started watching.
I think most of my fondest memories come from maybe a bit on average, a bit later than most people. So I didn't grow up in a family where football was important at all. My parents were divorced. I lived with my mum. She loves football, but only in a kind of entertainment way, like to sit down and watch a match rather than to be kind of invested in a team or anything like that. My dad doesn't even really like football, doesn't hate it or anything, but it's just not his thing. So football was like a peer group thing for me, which I absolutely loved it from when I was really little, but it was my thing in my family. I didn't have brothers and sisters growing up, so I had a best friend who was a complete football obsessive, and co-host of internationally beloved Manchester United podcast, The Rantcast. But I had posters from Shoot on my walls and stuff, but my fondest memories of football are from my sort of late teenage years, which funnily enough coincide with Man United being brilliant. I always loved United even when they were terrible. There's this game, Tottenham 3 Man United 3 from I think 1986, which is like this kind of It's like the proto football match in my head. It was just end to end. I think United might have gone 3-0 down and come back to 3-3 in the second half, but it was just absolutely a thrilling game of football, and I happened to have it taped on VHS because it was like a rare live match on British television at that time, and I watched that over and over and over again. So that's kind of the one really early game that I loved. Oh, and the other thing is, of course, like outside of club football, I was completely obsessed with the World Cup as a kid. So the 1986 World Cup is definitely right up there for me in fondest early childhood memories. When France beat Brazil in the quarterfinal of that World Cup, it was electric, especially since I think it happened after England had lost to Argentina, and that had been so sort of painful. But then I had this like backup plan of, my mum's French, so I get to support another team as well. Woohoo! Then that ended badly in the semi-finals. Well, anyway, that's a long rambling answer to your question, Joe.
Well, you sort of have kind of answered my second question already as well, in reference to your podcast co-host Ed. When you first started watching football, I was going to ask you if you remember who you shared that experience with. For a lot of people, it can be a parent, for example. It sounds like with you, it might have been with friends. Do you think that informed your relationship with that person or with the sport itself, or vice versa? And also, is that different now if that's no longer the case? And that's interesting because I imagine that you probably still do watch Manchester United games with Ed.
Well, my first football watching memory is watching the 1985 FA Cup final, and that I watched on telly with my dad, although I remember the goal going in, and my dad definitely wasn't in the room when the goal went in, so he was obviously like doing something else instead. But yeah, I didn't so much watch football with Ed as like experience it with him, because really watching football was hardly even a thing when I was a kid. There just was one match on a week which you would watch. Match of the Day was on like way past people's bedtimes, and it was well complicated to set the timers on video recorders if you had video recorders. So like, but playing football in the garden and pretending to be Brian Robson, or like, if it was the summer, Gary Lineker, that would be something that I experienced with Ed. And I guess I'm in a really unusual situation in that the person I most experienced football with as a child is someone who's intrinsically linked to my experience of football now. Like, we don't watch games together because we don't live in the same city, but we do forensically analyse them for hours on end to the varying degrees of entertainment of the listeners.
And do you think football is in some ways the, one of, if not the basis of your relationship with your friends like that?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. The thing is, like, a lot of my closest friends in real life aren't really football people, so it is like a specific. There are relationships in my life which are heavily linked to football, and my childhood best friend. Like, I was joking, I put the plug for the podcast in as kind of a joke, but, I do a podcast about the team we both love with my childhood best friend. That is amazing. And there's no way we would have the same closeness of relationship that we have now without football, because, we live in different cities, he's got a family, we've both got jobs. It's like, to sort of spend an hour and a half or 2 hours every week chatting with each other, that's something we wouldn't do if it wasn't for the kind of structure of what football gives to our lives, which I guess for a lot of people is like, you still go to games with people that you wouldn't otherwise see that often, and that kind of thing.
So does that mean then that if you weren't going to watch the football, or for whatever reason you chose to stop watching football, how would that affect your relationship with Ed?
Well, I think the first thing is there'd be like a real awkward conversation about our podcast. That'd be like, I think he might be a bit upset if I was like, I'm giving up football now, so we can't do this thing that's like.
But beyond that, what would you have stuff to talk about? Would your relationship still be a relationship?
Yeah, of course. Like, we talk about politics and family and culture and art and all that kind of stuff. And when I say art, I mean sitcoms. It sounded really highbrow, but I just want to be absolutely clear that I am talking about streaming television services, not the Tate Modern.
Because one of the reasons I'm interested in this question and finding out more about people's interest in football and what role maybe nostalgia plays is that I have an idea that it doesn't sound like it applies to everyone. And what's interesting about the process of recording these podcasts and talking to people like yourself, Paul, and the other people I've spoken to, is that I think the idea might be more based on my relationship with football than it is on anybody else's, and that I may have unintentionally assumed that everyone is the same as me. But what the idea that I had, and I'll go back to the thing about music, is that when you're a teenager, you develop bonds with these bands that stay with you forever, and you have a sort of generation of music. And I wondered if the same applied to football, and if, as people grow up, that the reason that they enjoy football changes, and maybe it's as a result of relationships that they have that are linked to the sport. Maybe it's just a different way of enjoying the entertainment. It's purely the aesthetic, or if you're really interested in the tactics or something. Because I feel like, when I was a child, my interest in football was very different, and it was very thrilling, and it was this kind of collective, exciting thing which I don't really experience now. And so the idea I had was that perhaps people who are a little bit older, who like football and watch football still, perhaps part of the reason that they do that is because they remember that they once loved it.
The thing is, I like football more now than I've ever liked football, by miles, and I'm way more engaged with it than I've ever been, by miles, because when I was a teenager, when I was a little kid, I loved football in a kind of abstract, because I didn't grow up in the city of the team that I supported, so I didn't regularly go to games. It wasn't a family thing, but I loved playing football on the playground and was kind of obsessed with it in that sense, and sticker albums and that sort of stuff. When I was a teenager, I was listening to music and growing my hair, and but I really liked football too. But it was a kind of it was one of the hobbies that I liked in my life. But now I've kind of got myself into a position where football is a massive part of my professional life. So there's never been a time that, the irony is, the post Sir Alex Ferguson era is the era in which I've most closely followed Man United. Not that we started the podcast in 2009, so since then I was kind of watching every single game without fail. But really, since I started writing about it and doing films and stuff, that was that's been the last 3 or 4 years, and that's when I've been kind of following social media about football and all that stuff. So I'm more into it now than I've ever been, really, and I like football more than I ever have as well, which is partly because I've finally been able to regularly go to games, which just wasn't a part of my experience growing up, and it has been a part of my experience in the last 4 or 5 years, or 3 or 4 years, and I've absolutely loved it. It's made me fall in love with football in a completely different way all over again. I mean, I'd been to games, but it was always a super exciting outing rather than a kind of semi-regular part of my routine. And so, I feel like nostalgia doesn't really dominate my relationship with football at all. I mean, listen, if you want to have a conversation about Roy Keane and Eric Cantona, I'll get seriously misty-eyed, and one of my favourite things to write, and it's actually something I end up writing a lot for uMAXit, because we're not necessarily driven by trying to write stuff which is extremely current and of the moment in the way that some places are. We're trying to write stuff which has a kind of broader, more long-term interest, and often that means writing kind of nostalgic things, and I love to do that. But I also love thinking about Paul Pogba and Henrik Mkhitaryan. It's the kind of I also think the technical level of football is just better than it's ever been as well. You go and watch any older football, it always 90s football looks incredibly exciting a lot of the times. You've got two teams just running at each other as fast as they can. But anything before that, really, even in the 80s, there's just a very different feel to games. The pitches are no good, and so I mean, culturally, football's obviously a mess in 2017, and the money thing is a massive problem. But equally, there were massive cultural problems in football from its origins. There were industrialists exploiting the working class for profit, and all that kind of stuff. It's not new that football's had its murky side. Although perhaps that's murkier than it's ever been. But, the short answer to the question is I still absolutely love football.
It's interesting that you talk about the crowd experience and about going to live games when it perhaps previously wasn't something that you regularly did. And I wonder whether that's something that is going to affect football in the coming years, as ticket prices seem to be getting more and more expensive. The cost of travel, generally the cost of going to a football game is quite expensive, and more expensive than some people can afford nowadays. And that has had an impact on the atmosphere of stadiums as well. Maybe that's anecdotal, but that's certainly what a lot of people would suggest. And I think one of the things I got from speaking to James Montague about this was that football really is a collective experience, and that whether that is as part of those close relationships, the one that you share with Ed, for example, how football is involved in that and how that benefits your relationship, or whether it is a sort of a broader relationship with yourself and the fans at a football game, there's something collective about it. A lot of my experience of football is obviously work-related, and also is isolated because the vast majority of my friends don't like football and don't watch football, so it's not something that I really take part in socially. I don't play football. Obviously, I have the opportunity to speak to colleagues and friends like yourself and other people who I work with, but I don't really share the footballing experience with them. So when I do interact with football, it tends to be watching it on the telly or on my laptop in my house on my own. And that is, that's very individualistic. That's not part of the collective experience at all. And maybe that's why I have this harbouring for nostalgia for a time when I did watch football with other people.
Yeah, maybe so. I mean, for me, one of the things is even when I don't go to games now, it feels like a collective experience because of social media, which isn't a universal positive by any stretch of the imagination, because it gets tiring and the kind of knee-jerk and also the out and out unpleasantness that happens is no good. But there are like a core of 1,000 people probably whom I regularly interact with during games, and that's a lot of people obviously, who are really fun and pleasant to interact with, and it makes it feel like a collective experience even when it's an individual experience. And I think that is another reason why I love football more today, and I'm kind of more emotionally invested in it in that sense, is because every game I watch, even when I am watching it on my own at home, there is a social component to that experience.
A lot of the people I'm talking to about this as well are journalists like yourself, and so I wonder if you think your work has had an impact on the way you feel about sport. You've mentioned already that you have the opportunity to go to the football a lot more often. You analyse it much more closely than you have done in the past. Sometimes when people work in the an environment or in the industry of something that they used to really like as a hobby, that can negatively affect the way they feel about it. How has it worked out for you?
Well, the thing is, first of all, I'm definitely not a journalist. Like, I'm a columnist, which is a completely different thing. It's I'm not breaking news stories. I'm not developing relationships. I'm writing analysis, which that is just how my brain works anyway. So, like, if I wasn't writing this stuff down, I'd still be thinking it. So that doesn't make me like football any less. In fact, like I said, and a lot of it has been going to games not for work, although I have done that regularly as well. And that has even more like made me love going to games, because then you get to go to the press conference. Like, I went to so many during Van Gaal's second season at United, and it was just fascinating having a front row seat to that. And that that was an incredible experience, which definitely added this whole nother dimension to my experience of football. But like last season, I kind of went back to going and sitting in the stands a lot, and I really love doing that too. But no, working in football definitely makes me like it more, because I spend more time thinking about it. But I'm in a really fortunate position, which kind of means that it's the kind of like getting a job in a chocolate factory kind of thing makes you start to hate chocolate. It's that feeling. But I don't get that because football is my part-time job. So it isn't kind of everything I do all day, every day. So I don't get completely saturated with it. I'm writing, 4 or 5 articles a week, and doing, a podcast and a few video appearances, and it's not overwhelming by any stretch of the imagination. So it is just like a slightly overdeveloped hobby, basically, for me, which is obviously that's super personal and super specific. But yeah, it means that there isn't any of that downside of like, oh no, not football again, sort of thing. I mean, I have to say, sometimes when United are terrible, you think, and there's like a kind of really dull like game against somebody, and you know it's, especially during that Van Gaal season, when you kind of know the football's going to be awful. There was a kind of sense of, here we go again about the whole thing, but that was about specifics of circumstances. That wasn't about football, the sport.
Paul, thank you very much for your time.
You're welcome, Joe, as always.